True Creepy Landlord Horror Stories 1. The Uninvited Guest. When Jenna first stepped into her new apartment, she was enchanted. The hardwood floors creaked with history, and the high ceilings gave the space an airy feel. Her landlord, Mr. Harris, was an older gentleman with a warm smile, offering her a friendly welcome. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, the charm began to wear thin. Jenna started to notice oddities. One evening, after a long day at work, she returned home to find her front door slightly ajar. She assumed she had forgotten to close it and pushed the door open. But the sense of unease lingered. As she settled in, she began to hear whispers and soft footsteps in the hallway during the night. At first, she thought it was just the building settling, but the sounds grew more pronounced, almost as if someone was walking outside her door. The following day, she casually mentioned the noises to Mr. Harris during a maintenance visit. He chuckled, claiming the old building had its quirks. "You get used to it," he said with a dismissive wave. But Jenna wasn't convinced. The feeling of being watched intensified, and soon she started finding small things out of place. Her favorite mug turned upside down, her books arranged in odd patterns. One particularly restless night, she awoke feeling an inexplicable chill. The room was dark, but something felt off. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Suddenly, she noticed a shadow flitting past her window, and her heart raced. She jumped out of bed and turned on the light, but nothing was there. The next morning, however, Jenna discovered a photograph on her floor, a picture of herself taken from outside her window. She hadn't recognized the figure in the shot, but felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jenna decided to confront Mr. Harris. When she approached him, he had an unsettling smile that made her stomach turn. "I like to keep an eye on my tenants," he said, his tone eerily calm. Panic surged through her. She realized she was being watched, not protected. After several sleepless nights, Jenna decided it was time to leave. She found a new place and moved out, but not before she learned from the neighbors that Mr. Harris had a long history of unsettling behavior. Previous tenants had reported being followed and stalked. Jenna's heart sank as she realized how close she had come to being another victim of his obsession. 2. The basement mystery. Mark had always dreamed of living on his own, so when he stumbled upon a cheap studio apartment in a charming neighborhood, he seized the opportunity. The only downside: the building had a notoriously creepy basement. Mrs. Greaves, the elderly landlord, warned him never to enter. She had lived in the building for decades and spoke of the basement in hushed, fearful tones, as if it held a dark secret best left untouched. Despite the warnings, Mark's curiosity gnawed at him. One night, feeling particularly adventurous, he decided to sneak down the creaky stairs to the basement. It was dimly lit, with flickering bulbs casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of neglect. As he explored, he found old furniture covered in sheets, forgotten relics of past tenants. But in the far corner, a locked door caught his eye. The door seemed oddly warm to the touch, sending chills down his spine. Mark couldn't resist trying the handle, but it was locked tight. Just as he was about to step away, he heard a voice behind him. "I told you not to come down here." It was Mrs. Greaves, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward the stairs. "You must leave this place. It's not safe." Shaken, Mark hurried back to his apartment. But the feeling of dread lingered, and that night he was plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures moving in the basement, their whispers echoing in his mind. Days turned into weeks, and Mark found himself feeling increasingly paranoid. He could have sworn he heard scratching sounds coming from the basement, as if something or someone was trying to escape. Determined to learn the truth, he started asking other tenants about the basement. They all responded with nervous glances and muttered warnings to stay away. One tenant finally confided in him, revealing that many years ago, someone had gone missing in the building, and rumors swirled about a hidden room in the basement. Feeling trapped by fear and mystery, Mark resolved to leave. He packed up his belongings and vacated the apartment. When he turned in his keys to Mrs. Greaves, her expression was unsettlingly calm, as if she had been expecting him to leave. As he walked away, he glanced back and saw her staring after him, her eyes dark and knowing. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something far worse than just a basement secret. 3. The hidden room. Samantha was excited to start a new chapter in her life when she found a quaint two-bedroom apartment in a historical building. The rent was surprisingly low, and her landlord, Mr. Jensen, was an eccentric but friendly man who had lived there for years. He warned her, however, about the third floor that had been sealed off for decades due to structural damage. Samantha didn't think much of it until she started hearing strange noises coming from above. It began with soft thuds, like someone pacing back and forth. Then came whispers, soft, almost indistinguishable, but persistent. At first, she attributed it to the building's age, but the sounds grew louder and more frantic. One rainy evening, curious and slightly unnerved, she ventured up to the third floor, only to find the door was indeed locked. But she noticed a faint light flickering beneath it. Against her better judgment, she decided to call Mr. Jensen. When he arrived, his demeanor shifted from friendly to tense. "You really shouldn't be up here," he insisted, his voice low. "It's for your own safety." But Samantha's curiosity was piqued. After he left, she couldn't resist the urge to investigate. That night, armed with a flashlight, she returned to the door. She found a loose board nearby and pried it off. It took some effort, but she managed to open the door just enough to slip through. What she found was a time capsule of despair. The remnants of a room frozen in time, with furniture covered in sheets and walls lined with peeling wallpaper. In the center of the room stood an old rocking chair, swaying gently despite the still air. As she stepped further inside, the whispers grew louder, this time more frantic and desperate. Suddenly, she felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the door slammed shut behind her. Panic set in as she turned to find the chair now facing her, empty but undeniably unsettling. In that moment, she understood. Someone had been trapped here, perhaps even dying for help. With all her strength, Samantha pushed against the door, and it flung open, sending her stumbling back into the hallway. She ran down the stairs, heart racing, and locked herself in her apartment. That night, the noises escalated, screams mingling with whispers, echoes of a past long forgotten. The next morning, she confronted Mr. Jensen, demanding to know what had happened. He hesitated, then told her the building's history. A tenant had gone missing from that very floor years ago, and many believed her spirit still roamed. Feeling increasingly trapped, Samantha decided to move out. When she returned to collect her belongings, she found a small diary tucked behind a loose floorboard, a diary belonging to the missing tenant. As she read the final entries, detailing her fear and isolation, Samantha realized the truth. The landlord had kept the truth hidden, and she had narrowly escaped being another lost soul in the building's dark history. These chilling experiences remind us that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding under our beds, but the ones who hold the keys to our homes. 4. The curious case of Mrs. Thompson. Emily had always been a city girl, and when she stumbled upon a charming one-bedroom apartment owned by Mrs. Thompson, she couldn't resist. The price was low, and the location was ideal, nestled in a quaint neighborhood filled with old trees and friendly faces. Mrs. Thompson was a sweet, elderly woman who seemed to genuinely care for her tenants. However, there was one peculiar rule: no visitors after dark. At first, Emily thought this was just a quirky landlord's policy, but soon the reason became clear. One night, she heard the unmistakable sound of sobbing coming from the hallway. Concerned, she opened her door to check, only to find Mrs. Thompson standing there, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "It's not safe out there," she whispered, trembling. "You must stay inside." Curiosity piqued, Emily decided to investigate. She began talking to her neighbors, only to discover that several had moved out abruptly. Each shared strange stories about Mrs. Thompson, how she would stand outside at night, staring into the darkness, waiting for something or someone. One evening, while Emily was reading in bed, she heard a series of frantic knocks at her door. Heart racing, she opened it to find Mrs. Thompson, her hair disheveled and clothes torn. "You have to help me," she gasped. "They're coming for me." Before Emily could respond, Mrs. Thompson vanished down the stairs. Worried, Emily followed but found nothing. The building was eerily quiet. When she returned to her apartment, she discovered a photo on the floor, a picture of Mrs. Thompson from years ago, surrounded by other tenants who looked disturbingly happy. The next day, Emily confronted Mrs. Thompson, who looked even more frail. "Please, don't ask questions," she begged. "I've kept you safe, but they are always watching." Feeling trapped, Emily decided to leave. As she packed, she found another photo, this one depicting the building's exterior. Behind the facade, a shadowy figure loomed. As she slipped the last box into her car, she glanced back at the building and saw Mrs. Thompson standing at the window, her expression unreadable. It was then that Emily knew she had escaped just in time. 5. The locked door. Daniel moved into an old Victorian house that had been converted into apartments. The landlord, Mr. Brooks, was a reclusive man who rarely made appearances. He had one peculiar rule: residents were strictly forbidden from entering the attic. Daniel was intrigued. As the weeks went by, he noticed strange noises coming from above, thuds and whispers that crept into his dreams. One night, unable to resist, he climbed the stairs leading to the attic door. It was locked, but the sound of something scraping against the floorboards inside sent shivers down his spine. Determined to uncover the mystery, Daniel began asking other tenants about the attic. Most looked uncomfortable and quickly changed the subject. However, one older tenant, Mrs. Ramirez, finally spoke up. "Years ago, there was a terrible accident up there," she whispered. "They say the previous tenant was never found. The landlord keeps it locked to hide what really happened." That night, unable to shake the feeling of dread, Daniel decided to confront Mr. Brooks. When he approached him the next day, the landlord's demeanor changed. His eyes darkened and he warned, "Stay away from the attic. You don't want to know what's up there." But Daniel's curiosity had become an obsession. One stormy night, he picked the lock on the attic door, heart racing as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the light from his flashlight illuminated a disorganized jumble of old furniture and boxes. But in the far corner, something caught his eye, a large trunk slightly ajar. As he approached, he felt a cold draft sweep through the room. The trunk creaked open, revealing faded photographs and clothes. In the back, he found a diary belonging to the missing tenant, detailing her fears and strange occurrences in the house. As he read, he felt a presence behind him, cold and oppressive. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers he had heard for weeks grew louder, echoing his name. Just as he thought he might be trapped forever, he threw himself against the door one last time, and it burst open. He stumbled back into the hallway, gasping for air, but the experience had left him shaken. The next day, he confronted Mr. Brooks one final time, demanding answers. The landlord's expression was cold, devoid of concern. "You shouldn't have gone up there," he said, his voice chilling. "Now it knows you." Daniel moved out that very day, vowing never to look back. He later learned that the house had a reputation for vanishing tenants, and he felt lucky to have escaped its sinister grip. 6. The cursed apartment. Laura thought she had found her dream apartment when she moved into a historic building with stunning architectural details and a vibrant community. The landlord, Mr. Whittaker, was an affable man who regaled her with tales of the building's rich history. However, he always warned her about the second-floor apartment, which had remained vacant for years. "Don't go in there," he said with a nervous laugh. "Strange things happen to those who do." Laura brushed it off as superstition until she began to experience unsettling occurrences. Objects in her apartment would shift positions overnight, and shadows flitted past her windows when no one was around. Her neighbors began to avoid her, whispering about the cursed nature of the second-floor apartment. Determined to discover the truth, Laura started investigating the building's history. She unearthed newspaper articles about the mysterious disappearance of the last tenant, a young woman named Claire, who had vanished without a trace. As she read further, she found accounts of strange events that had plagued other tenants in that apartment before her. One night, emboldened by her research, Laura decided to sneak into the second-floor apartment. The door creaked open, revealing a dusty, dimly lit space frozen in time. Furniture lay draped in white sheets, and the air was thick with neglect. As she stepped further inside, she felt an icy chill and heard faint sobbing. She turned toward the sound and saw a figure, a woman in a vintage dress, her eyes filled with sadness. "Help me," the apparition whispered. "I'm trapped." Panicked but curious, Laura reached out, only for the figure to dissolve into mist. The room grew colder, and Laura felt an overwhelming urge to flee. As she turned to leave, The door slammed shut behind her. Frantic, she pounded on it, yelling for help, but the walls seemed to close in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door swung open. Laura stumbled back into her own apartment, heart pounding. She knew she had to leave. The next day, she confronted Mr. Whittaker, telling him about her experience. He looked pale and shaken. "I was hoping you wouldn't go in there," he confessed. "Claire's spirit has never found peace. Many have tried to help her, but she only takes more." Laura packed her belongings in a frenzy, eager to escape. As she left, she glanced back at the building, feeling a cold presence watching her. She never looked back, but the sense of unease lingered long after she moved on, a haunting reminder of the past that refused to be forgotten. 7. The silent neighbor. Nina was thrilled to find a cozy apartment at a great price, but she quickly learned that her neighbor, Mr. Grayson, was an odd man. The landlord, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Collins, warned her about him. "He keeps to himself. Just don't engage," she advised. At first, Nina respected this boundary. But as time passed, she noticed strange occurrences. Mr. Grayson would often stare at her from his window, his expression unreadable. His apartment was always dark, the curtains drawn tight, and she never heard any sounds coming from inside. It was as if he were a ghost. One evening, while bringing in groceries, Nina heard a faint tapping sound from Mr. Grayson's window. When she looked up, he was standing there, staring intently at her, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the glass. Unnerved, she hurried inside. The following day, she found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a handwritten note. "They're watching you." Confused and frightened, Nina glanced out her window to see Mr. Grayson standing in his yard, still staring. Feeling trapped, she decided to confront him. Knocking on his door, she was surprised when it creaked open. The apartment was dark and cluttered, filled with old newspapers and what looked like surveillance equipment. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and gruff. "I just want to know what's going on," she replied, her heart racing. He hesitated, then stepped back, revealing a wall covered in photos of her taken from various angles, some through her window, some in public places. "I'm protecting you," he said, his eyes wide with fervor. "They're everywhere. You have to trust me." Terrified, Nina backed away and fled. She immediately went to Mrs. Collins, explaining everything. The landlord's face turned pale. "I had hoped it wouldn't come to this," she whispered. "He was a tenant here long before you. I thought he was harmless." Mrs. Collins called the police, but when they arrived, Mr. Grayson had vanished. His apartment was empty, as if he had never been there at all. The officers assured Nina it would be fine, but she felt anything but safe. That night, she packed her things and moved out, leaving behind the eerie building its silent neighbor. As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched, the eyes of Mr. Grayson following into the night. 8. The ghostly rental. Maya had always dreamed of living in a historic building, so when she found an old townhouse for rent, she jumped at the chance. The landlord, Mrs. Caldwell, was an elderly woman with a warm smile who regaled Maya with tales of the house's history. She mentioned the previous tenant, a young woman named Margaret, who had mysteriously vanished years ago. Maya found the story intriguing but didn't think much of it until strange things began happening. The first incident occurred late one night while Maya was reading in bed. She heard soft footsteps above her, as if someone was pacing the floorboards. Confused, she dismissed it as the house settling. However, the next night, she heard a soft humming, a haunting melody that drifted through the walls. It was beautiful yet melancholic, sending chills down her spine. Determined to find out more, Maya asked Mrs. Caldwell about Margaret. The old woman's expression darkened. "Some say her spirit lingers here, searching for something she lost," she murmured. "But it's best not to dwell on the past." Maya brushed off the warning, convinced it was just an old lady's tale. But as the days passed, the humming grew louder, echoing through her dreams. She began finding strange items in her apartment, a locket with a faded photograph, a diary filled with fragmented thoughts, and finally, a letter addressed to someone named James. One evening, while sitting on the porch, she noticed a figure standing in the window above her. It was a woman, dressed in a vintage gown, looking out with sorrowful eyes. Fear gripped Maya as she realized it was Margaret. The woman's gaze seemed to plead for help. Panicked, Maya decided to confront Mrs. Caldwell again. This time, the landlord looked grave. "You must help her find peace," she said, her voice trembling. She never wanted to leave this world. Determined to honor Margaret's memory, Maya gathered the items she had found and set up a small altar in her living room, lighting a candle and placing the locket and diary on display. That night, as she slept, the humming returned, stronger than ever. In her dreams, she saw Margaret reaching out, desperate and lost. The following morning, Maya awoke to find the locket glowing faintly. As she held it, a wave of sadness washed over her, and suddenly she understood. Margaret was searching for closure, a way to say goodbye to the life she had left behind. Maya decided to write a letter addressed to James, explaining the situation and assuring Margaret that she was not forgotten. She placed it with the other items and burned it in the candlelight, whispering a prayer for peace. That night, the humming faded, replaced by a warm sense of calm. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences ceased. Maya felt a weight lifted from the house, as if Margaret had finally found the peace she longed for. When she moved out months later, she left behind a small bouquet of flowers on the altar as a final farewell. 9. The Watchful Eye. Rachel was excited to start her new life in a cozy apartment complex. The landlord, Mr. Baker, seemed friendly enough, but she quickly learned he had an obsession with privacy. He often told tenants to keep their curtains drawn and their doors locked. "It's for your safety," he insisted, his gaze lingering a little too long. At first, Rachel thought it was just a quirky personality trait. But as the weeks passed, she began to notice odd behavior. Mr. Baker would appear at strange hours, peering into windows and checking doors. When confronted, he'd smile and say he was merely ensuring everyone's safety. One night, Rachel heard scratching at her window. Cautiously, she pulled back the curtain to find Mr. Baker standing outside, his face illuminated by the streetlight. "Just checking on you," he said, his tone too casual. Shaken, Rachel closed the curtain and locked the door, her heart racing. The following day, she decided to confront him, but he was nowhere to be found. Instead, she spoke with her neighbors, who shared unsettling stories of previous tenants who had felt similarly watched. Some claimed they had found their belongings moved, while others had heard whispers in the night. Determined to take action, Rachel decided to document her experiences. She set up a camera to record her apartment, hoping to capture any strange occurrences. What she found was chilling. Footage of Mr. Baker sneaking around her door late at night, peering in as if he were waiting for her to fall asleep. Furious and frightened, Rachel approached the local authorities. When they investigated, they found Mr. Baker's apartment filled with old photographs of tenants, some taken without their knowledge. They arrested him, but not before Rachel learned that he had been evicted from several other properties for similar behavior. As she moved out, she felt a mixture of relief and unease. The experience left her shaken, reminding her that sometimes the most frightening. 10. The inherited house. When Jacob inherited his grandmother's old house, he was thrilled. He had fond memories of visiting as a child, but he was also aware of the whispers about the property being haunted. The landlord was a distant cousin, Uncle Harold, who had managed the estate while Jacob lived abroad. Upon moving in, Jacob noticed peculiar things. Objects would shift positions, and he often felt cold drafts despite the warm weather. At first, he brushed it off as nostalgia playing tricks on him, but the incidents escalated. One night, he heard the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the halls. Confused, he searched the house, but found nothing. Determined to uncover the truth, Jacob began digging into his family's history. He discovered that his grandmother had raised her sister's children after their parents died in a tragic accident. The children, 2 sisters, were said to have been playful spirits who roamed the house, bringing joy to those who lived there. But after one of the sisters mysteriously vanished, the laughter turned to whispers of sadness. One evening, while sitting in the living room, Jacob felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. He turned to find a little girl in a faded dress standing beside him, her eyes wide and pleading. "Help me find her," she whispered before vanishing. Jacob knew he had to act. He spent hours researching and piecing together the family's tragic past, finally locating the site of the accident. It turned out to be nearby, and he arranged a small memorial for the sisters. That night, he felt a palpable change in the house. The air felt lighter and the playful laughter returned, echoing joyfully through the rooms. He realized he had given the sisters the closure they needed. As Jacob settled into his new life, the house transformed into a sanctuary filled with love and laughter. The spirits of his family were no longer lost. They had found their peace, and he felt their presence guiding him, a comforting reminder of the past. 11. The tenant next door. Sarah was thrilled to move into her new apartment, which had everything she wanted: a great location, charming decor, and a friendly landlord named Mrs. Patterson. However, Sarah quickly discovered that her neighbor, a reclusive man named Greg, had a reputation for being eccentric. Greg was rarely seen, and when he was, he avoided eye contact and spoke in whispers. Sarah noticed strange noises coming from his apartment, faint thuds, muffled conversations, and sometimes even the sound of crying. The other tenants warned her to steer clear of him, claiming he had a dark past. One night, while trying to sleep, Sarah heard loud banging coming from Greg's apartment. Concerned, she called Mrs. Patterson, who seemed oddly uninterested. "He's just going through some things," she said dismissively. "Don't get involved." Despite the warnings, Sarah's curiosity got the best of her. She decided to knock on Greg's door to check on him. After several moments, he finally opened it, revealing a disheveled room filled with boxes and old photographs. "What do you want?" he asked, his eyes darting nervously. "Are you okay?" "I heard some noise," she replied hesitantly. He hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings and photographs of missing persons, each marked with red circles and lines connecting them. "I'm trying to find them," he whispered. "They were taken. I know it." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized he was obsessed with finding those who had vanished. "Greg, you need help," she said softly, backing away. Before she could leave, he grabbed her arm. "They're watching us." "They don't want us to know the truth." Panic surged through her, and she broke free, fleeing back to her apartment. The next day, Sarah confronted Mrs. Patterson about Greg's behavior, but she merely shrugged it off. "He's harmless. Just don't provoke him." Days turned into weeks, and Sarah felt increasingly unsafe. Strange occurrences followed her. Items in her apartment would go missing, and she had the eerie sensation of being watched. One night, she was jolted awake by loud banging on her door. It was Greg, looking more frantic than ever. "They're coming for you," he shouted. "You have to help me find them." Terrified, Sarah locked the door and called the police. When they arrived, Greg had disappeared, leaving only a stack of old photos in the hallway. The police searched his apartment, but he was nowhere to be found. They advised Sarah to stay away from him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow connected to her growing sense of dread. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, she moved out. As she drove away, she glanced back at the building, feeling a mix of relief and unease. Greg had vanished, but the memories of his obsession lingered, reminding her that some mysteries are best left unsolved. 12. The basement door. When Jenna moved into an old duplex, she was excited by the charming architecture and its proximity to her job. The landlord, Mr. Ellis, seemed pleasant, but he had one strict rule: the basement was off limits. "It's not safe down there," he insisted, his expression serious. At first, Jenna thought nothing of it, but as weeks went by, she heard odd sounds emanating from below, soft thumps and whispers that made her skin crawl. Her curiosity grew, and one night, unable to resist, she decided to investigate. She found the basement door slightly ajar. Heart racing, she pushed it open and descended the creaky stairs. The air was damp and musty, filled with shadows. In the dim light, Jenna spotted a small pile of old furniture and boxes covered in dust. But then she saw something that made her blood run cold. A series of photographs pinned to the wall. Each picture was a black and white image of previous tenants, their expressions ranging from confusion to sheer terror. Jenna's stomach twisted as she realized that many of them had vanished without a trace. She backed away slowly, ready to flee, when she heard a soft voice behind her. "Help me." Turning quickly, she found a girl standing in the corner, her eyes wide and pleading. "I'm trapped here. You have to get me out." Panic surged through Jenna as she scrambled back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind her. She spent the rest of the night wide awake, the girl's voice echoing in her mind. The next day, Jenna confronted Mr. Ellis, demanding to know what was happening in the basement. He turned pale, his demeanor shifting. "You shouldn't have gone down there," he said, his voice trembling. "Those who enter don't always come back." Frightened, Jenna packed her things and decided to move out. As she left, she glanced back at the house, feeling a sense of dread. The basement door was still slightly open, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. 13. The unwanted guest. After moving into a small apartment, Ben was looking forward to starting fresh. The landlord, Mr. Gray, was a peculiar man who seemed overly invested in his tenants' lives. He frequently stopped by unannounced, often bearing gifts of baked goods or unsolicited advice. At first, Ben found Mr. Gray charming, but he soon grew uneasy. One evening, he noticed a shadowy figure lurking outside his window. When he looked closer, he saw it was Mr. Gray, standing still, staring into his apartment. "Just checking on you," he called cheerfully, waving. Ben's discomfort grew as he noticed more oddities. Items in his apartment would be rearranged, and sometimes he'd find unfamiliar objects left on his kitchen counter. The final straw came when he discovered a small camera hidden in a decorative item in the living room. Feeling violated, Ben decided to confront Mr. Gray. He demanded to know what was going on. The landlord's expression shifted, and he laughed it off. "Just trying to keep an eye on my best tenants," he replied, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. That night, Ben couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He locked his doors and tried to sleep, but every creak in the building sent him into a panic. He finally decided to leave and found himself gathering his belongings in a frenzy. As he packed, he glanced outside and saw Mr. Gray standing in the shadows watching him. Fear gripped him, and he fled the apartment without looking back. He later learned that several other tenants had experienced similar invasions of privacy and had moved out without warning. Ben realized he had narrowly escaped a deeply unsettling situation, leaving Mr. Gray behind as a chilling memory. 14. The rented room. Sophie was excited to rent a room in an old Victorian house with several other young professionals. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, seemed kind and welcoming, often sharing stories of the house's history. However, he had one rule: no one was allowed on the third floor. Curiosity gnawed at Sophie, especially when she heard strange noises coming from above, soft footsteps, whispers, and the occasional sound of furniture moving. One day, she mustered the courage to ask Mr. Thompson about it. He simply smiled and waved it off, insisting it was just the house settling. Unable to resist, Sophie climbed the stairs one afternoon while the others were at work. The third floor was dark and dusty, filled with old furniture and boxes. As she explored, she felt an unsettling sensation, as if she were being watched. In one of the rooms, she discovered a collection of antique dolls, their eyes staring blankly ahead. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Heart racing, Sophie turned to find the room empty, but the air felt charged. As she tried to open the door, she heard soft giggles and whispers echoing around her. Panicking, she yanked the door open and fled down the stairs. That night, Sophie confided in her roommates about what she had experienced. They exchanged worried glances, revealing that each had felt a strange presence on the third floor. The next day, they all agreed to confront Mr. Thompson. When they approached him, he looked taken aback. "You shouldn't have gone up there," he warned, his voice low and urgent. "The house has its secrets." Feeling trapped, they decided to leave the next morning. As they packed, the whispers intensified, echoing through the halls. They'd fled the house, vowing never to return. The experience left them shaken, a haunting reminder that some places are best left unexplored. 15. The empty apartment. Tom was excited to find a spacious apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The landlord, Mrs. Jenkins, was an older woman with a no-nonsense attitude, but she seemed genuinely invested in her tenants' well-being. However, she frequently warned him about the apartment next door, which had been vacant for years. "It's cursed," she said with a shudder. "Nobody stays there long." Tom laughed it off, but as he settled in, he began to notice strange things. The lights in the empty apartment flickered on and off, and he could hear muffled voices coming through the walls at night. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if something was watching him. One night, he decided to investigate. He knocked on the door to the empty apartment, but there was no answer. Driven by curiosity, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and everything was left as if frozen in time. All newspapers were scattered across the floor, and the faint scent of decay lingered. As he wandered through the darkened rooms, he stumbled upon a diary lying open on the floor. The last entry read, "I can feel it coming for me. I need to get out." Chills ran down his spine as he heard a low whisper behind him, "You shouldn't be here." He turned to find a shadowy figure standing in the corner, eyes hollow and expression haunting. Fear overtook him, and he fled the apartment, slamming the door behind him. That night, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread, and sleep eluded him. The next day, Tom confronted Mrs. Jenkins, demanding to know what happened in the empty apartment. Her expression darkened. "A tenant went missing years ago. No one knows what happened, but it's best to stay away." Unable to endure the oppressive atmosphere any longer, Tom packed his things and left the building, vowing never to return. As he drove away, he glanced back at the apartment, the shadow still lingering in his mind. 16. The unseen roommate. When Alex moved into a charming old apartment, he felt lucky to find such an affordable place in a trendy neighborhood. The landlord, a middle-aged man named Mr. Hale, seemed friendly but had a peculiar rule. No guests after 10 p.m., it's for everyone's safety, he insisted, but Alex brushed it off as eccentricity. At first, everything seemed normal, but soon he noticed strange things happening. Objects in his apartment would be misplaced, and he often felt a chill when he was alone. One night, while watching TV, he heard the unmistakable sound of someone whispering his name. Startled, he looked around, but the apartment was empty. Concerned, Alex spoke to his neighbor, who mentioned a previous tenant who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. "They say she never left," she whispered. "Sometimes you can feel her presence." Feeling uneasy, Alex decided to investigate. He began digging into the building's history and discovered that several tenants had reported similar experiences. The ghost of the missing woman seemed to linger, searching for something or someone. Determined to confront the issue, Alex decided to hold a small gathering with friends. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew tense. The lights flickered, and a heavy silence fell over the room. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen, causing everyone to jump. They rushed in to find a cabinet door swinging open, dishes scattered on the floor. Alex felt a cold breath on his neck, and he turned to see a shadow dart past the window. "We should leave," one friend suggested, but the group hesitated, caught between fear and curiosity. That night, Alex couldn't sleep. He felt as though someone was watching him. The next day, he confronted Mr. Hale about the rumors, but the landlord dismissed them. "Just stories to scare the weak," he scoffed, but his eyes betrayed an underlying fear. Desperate for peace, Alex decided to perform a small ceremony to honor the lost tenant. He lit a candle and spoke her name, acknowledging her presence. That night, he finally felt a sense of calm, as if the weight of the past had lifted. Though he continued to experience odd occurrences, the energy in the apartment shifted. It was as if the spirit had found solace in being remembered. Alex learned to coexist with the unseen roommate, finding comfort in the fact that he was not alone. 17. The House of Mirrors. Mia was thrilled when she found a stunning apartment that had once been a grand home. The landlord, Mrs. Caldwell, was an older woman with a mysterious air. She warned Mia about the mirrors that adorned the walls. "They hold memories," she said cryptically. "Be cautious." Intrigued, Mia moved in and began decorating. The mirrors, framed in ornate gold, fascinated her. But as she settled in, she started to notice odd reflections, flickers of movement that didn't match her own. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, but the sensations intensified. One night, while getting ready for bed, Mia caught a glimpse of a figure in the mirror behind her. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face twisted in anguish. Heart racing, Mia turned around, but the room was empty. She could feel the woman's sorrow weighing heavily on her. Determined to understand what was happening, Mia researched the house's history and discovered that a woman named Evelyn had lived there decades ago. She had been rumored to have gone mad, obsessively looking into the mirrors until she vanished without a trace. That evening, Mia confronted Mrs. Caldwell about the woman's fate. The landlord's expression turned grave. "Evelyn couldn't escape her own reflection," she murmured. "Some say her spirit still seeks a way out." Feeling a connection, Mia decided to reach out to Evelyn. She placed flowers in front of the largest mirror and spoke her name aloud, hoping to offer solace. As she did, the temperature in the room dropped and the mirrors began to shimmer. Over the next few days, Mia felt an overwhelming sense of calm, as if Evelyn's spirit was finding peace. She no longer saw the tortured reflection, but she continued to keep the flowers by the mirror, honoring the memory of the woman who had once been trapped. 18. The Basement of Secrets. Tom and Lisa were excited to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in an old brick building. The landlord, Mr. Grant, was an odd character who frequently mentioned the basement. "Stay out of there," he warned, his tone grave. "It's dangerous." Initially, they respected the rule, but after a few weeks, curiosity got the better of them. They started hearing strange noises coming from the basement, scratching, thumping, and even whispers that echoed through the walls. One evening, they could no longer resist. Armed with flashlights, they crept down the dimly lit stairs. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and a heavy door at the far end. As they approached, they heard distinct voices coming from behind it, muffled yet urgent. Heart pounding, they tried the handle, but it was locked. Frustrated, they returned to their apartment, only to discover that strange occurrences began to escalate. Items went missing, and they started having vivid nightmares about being trapped in a dark space. Each morning, they'd find the front door slightly ajar, even though they were sure they had locked it. Desperate for answers, they confronted Mr. Grant. He became visibly anxious, warning them again to stay away from the basement. "You don't want to disturb what's down there," he insisted, but he refused to elaborate. Determined to uncover the truth, Tom and Lisa devised a plan. They would go back to the basement during the day, when the sunlight could penetrate the darkness. Armed with tools, they managed to pry open the heavy door, revealing a small, windowless room filled with old boxes and strange symbols drawn on the walls. Suddenly, a gust of cold air swept through the room, and they heard the voices again, clearer this time. "Help us," they echoed. The couple stumbled back, realizing they had opened a door to something they weren't prepared to confront. Freaked out, they slammed the door shut and fled the basement, deciding to leave the apartment altogether. As they packed their belongings, they could still hear the whispers calling out to them. The experience left them shaken, a haunting reminder of the secrets that lie beneath the surface. 19. The Haunted Rental. After a tough breakup, Claire needed a fresh start and found a cozy studio apartment at a reasonable price. The landlord, Mrs. Sinclair, was a sweet old lady who warned her about the building's history. "It's been around for a long time," she said. "Some say it's haunted, but don't worry, it's just spirits passing through." At first, Claire laughed off the warnings, but she soon began to feel uneasy. Shadows flitted past her windows, and strange sounds echoed in the night, soft whispers, footsteps, and even the sound of a child's laughter. She brushed it off as her imagination running wild. One night, while preparing for bed, Claire saw a little girl in a white dress standing at the foot of her bed. The girl had hollow eyes and an eerie smile. "Help me find my doll," she whispered before vanishing into thin air. Heart racing, Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Determined to uncover the truth, Claire began researching the building's history. She discovered that a child had gone missing decades ago, rumored to have been last seen in the very apartment she now occupied. The more she learned, the more she felt a connection to the girl. That evening, Claire decided to set up a small memorial for the lost child. She placed a doll on the windowsill, hoping to honor her memory. As she did, the temperature in the room dropped, and the whispers grew louder, filling the air with a sense of urgency. The next day, Claire confronted Mrs. Sinclair, who listened intently. "Many have tried to help her," the landlord said softly, "but she needs someone to truly listen." As Claire continued to acknowledge the girl's presence, the strange occurrences shifted. The whispers grew softer, and the atmosphere lightened. The girl's spirit seemed to find solace in being remembered, and Claire felt a comforting warmth envelop her. Though the apartment still had its quirks, Claire found peace in her new home. The haunting transformed into a companionship, reminding her that sometimes the spirits of the past simply seek to be acknowledged. 20. The Room Above. Jake was excited to move into a historic building known for its beautiful architecture and vibrant community. The landlord, Mr. Thompson, was a charismatic man who loved sharing tales about the building's past. He often warned tenants about the apartment above him, which had been vacant for years. "It's best to stay away from there," he said with a grin. "You never know what you might find." At first, Jake took it as just a quirky story. But after settling in, he began hearing strange noises from above, thumps, dragging sounds, and the occasional creak of floorboards. One night, he was jolted awake by loud banging, followed by a low moan that sent chills down his spine. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jake decided to investigate. He climbed the stairs leading to the upper apartment, which was marked "Do Not Enter." The door creaked open at his touch, revealing a dark space filled with dust and old furniture. As he stepped inside, he felt an oppressive weight in the air. The shadows seemed to dance around him, and he heard whispers that echoed through the room. "Help us," they beckoned, growing louder. Panicking, Jake turned to leave, but noticed a dusty photograph on the floor. It showed a group of people who once lived there, their smiles bright yet haunting. Something in the image caught his eye. One of the women had a striking resemblance to his late grandmother. Confusion flooded his mind as memories rushed back. His grandmother had always talked about her childhood home, where she lost several siblings in a tragic accident. The realization hit him hard. The spirits of the apartment were his family, trapped and longing for connection. Feeling an overwhelming sense of duty, Jake returned to his own apartment and began to research his family history. He learned more about the tragic events that had taken place in the building, and he realized he needed to honor their memory. He created a small altar in his apartment, displaying the photograph along with candles and flowers. That night, he lit the candles and spoke to the spirits, acknowledging their presence and promising to remember them. Over the following weeks, the noises began to fade and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Jake felt a sense of peace enveloping him, as if his family had finally found the release they needed. The once haunting apartment transformed into a source of comfort, a reminder that love transcends even the boundaries of life and death. 21. The clock that tick-tocked too loudly. Emma thought she'd found the perfect place when she moved into a vintage apartment with high ceilings and intricate woodwork. The landlord, Mr. Harris, was an older gentleman with a quirky charm. He had one peculiar request: never touch the old grandfather clock in the hallway. "It's been here for generations," he said. "Just let it be." Intrigued, Emma respected his wishes, at least at first. But as the days passed, she began to hear the clock ticking loudly in the dead of night, even when she knew it had stopped. The rhythmic sound echoed through the walls, growing louder and more insistent. It felt as though it was counting down to something. One night, unable to sleep, Emma ventured into the hallway. The clock stood ominously in the dark, its hands frozen at midnight. She reached out to touch it, curiosity getting the better of her. As her fingers brushed the surface, a chilling wind blew through the hallway, extinguishing the lights. In the darkness, she heard whispers, a chorus of voices calling her name. "Help us, set us free." The air turned frigid, and Emma stumbled back, terrified. She rushed back to her apartment, her heart racing. The next day, she confronted Mr. Harris, demanding to know what was happening. He sighed heavily, his expression serious. "That clock has kept time for those who lost their way," he explained. "It's a gateway, but it's also a trap. The souls are restless." Determined to put an end to the haunting, Emma devised a plan. She would return to the clock and perform a small ritual, hoping to release the trapped spirits. That night, she lit a candle and spoke their names aloud, acknowledging their pain. As she did, the clock's hands began to move, ticking in reverse. The whispers grew louder, but this time they felt like a release. The temperature in the hallway warmed, and Emma sensed a weight lifting. The next morning, she found the clock had stopped entirely, its presence no longer ominous. From that day forward, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted. Emma felt a newfound sense of peace, as if the spirits had finally found their way home. 22. The painting in the attic. When Sarah moved into a quaint cottage, she was enchanted by its rustic charm. The landlord, Mrs. Davis, was an elderly woman with a warm smile, but she often warned Sarah about the attic. "It's best not to go up there," she said with a hint of concern. "Some things are better left alone." Curiosity nagged at Sarah, and one rainy afternoon, she decided to explore the attic. Climbing the creaky stairs, she found it filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and a large, covered painting propped against the wall. Drawn to it, she pulled off the cloth and gasped. The painting depicted a woman in a flowing gown, her eyes hauntingly familiar. The longer Sarah stared, the more she felt an unsettling connection to the figure. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the attic and the lights flickered. The woman in the painting seemed to come alive, her eyes pleading. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Strange sounds echoed through the house, soft sobs and whispers that felt like a warning. Unable to sleep, she returned to the attic, feeling compelled to confront the painting. As she stood before it, she felt an overwhelming sadness wash over her. "What do you want?" she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. In response, the air grew thick with emotion, and the temperature dropped. The woman in the painting appeared to be reaching out, her lips moving silently. Determined to help, Sarah decided to reach out to Mrs. Davis. When she shared her experience, the landlord's face turned pale. "That's Eleanor," she said softly. "She lived here long ago and vanished mysteriously. The painting was her last testament." Feeling a sense of urgency, Sarah gathered a few friends for a seance to communicate with Eleanor's spirit. As they sat in a circle, the room darkened and the atmosphere shifted. They felt a cold presence enveloping them. In a whispered voice, Eleanor spoke through Sarah. "I'm trapped. Help me find my rest." With tears in her eyes, Sarah promised to honor Eleanor's memory. Afterward, she painted a small mural in the attic, depicting Eleanor surrounded by light. That night, the air felt lighter and the haunting whispers faded. Sarah could sense Eleanor's gratitude, and from that day on, the cottage felt like a true home, filled with warmth and peace. 23. The Forgotten Child. After losing her job, Lily moved into a budget-friendly apartment complex. The landlord, Mr. Jenkins, was a stern man with little patience for questions. He warned her about the third-floor unit, which had been empty for years. "It's not fit for anyone," he said, his tone dismissive. Lily was intrigued, and soon strange things began to happen. She heard the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the halls, despite no children living in the building. At night, she'd find toys left on her doorstep, tiny dolls and cars that hadn't been there before. One evening, she finally decided to investigate the vacant unit. The door creaked open, revealing a dusty, dimly lit room. As she stepped inside, she felt a cold breeze and heard the unmistakable sound of giggling. A small, shadowy figure darted past her, leaving a chill in its wake. "Who are you?" Lily called, but there was no answer. The atmosphere grew thick with sorrow, and she felt a deep sense of loss. Determined to help, she returned to her apartment and began researching the building's history. She discovered that a child had gone missing years ago, rumored to have wandered into the vacant unit and never returned. Realizing the child's spirit was trapped, Lily decided to hold a small memorial in the empty room, laying out toys and flowers as an offering. That night, she felt a presence watching over her. The air was charged with energy, and the child's laughter rang through the room, this time more joyful. She could almost see the little figure, a small girl with bright eyes and a radiant smile. With each passing day, the atmosphere in the building shifted. The toys stopped appearing, and the laughter became less frequent. Lily felt a sense of relief, knowing she had given the child the recognition and love she needed. 24. The Locked Room. Moving into an older apartment complex, Rachel was excited about her new start. The landlord, Mr. Foster, was a friendly man who seemed eager to help, but he had one strict rule: never enter the locked room at the end of the hall. "It's just storage," he said. "Trust me, it's for the best." Intrigued, Rachel couldn't shake her curiosity. She started hearing strange noises at night, scratching sounds and muffled voices coming from behind the locked door. The rest of the tenants avoided it, casting nervous glances in its direction. One night, the sounds grew louder, and Rachel decided to confront her fears. She managed to find a way to pick the lock, her heart racing as the door creaked open. Inside, the room was filled with dust and old furniture, but what caught her eye was a vintage mirror hanging on the wall. As she approached, she felt a strange energy emanating from the mirror. When she looked into it, she gasped. Reflected back was a distorted version of herself, a dark, twisted figure that grinned menacingly. Terrified, she stumbled back, feeling a cold breath on her neck. Panicking, Rachel slammed the door shut and rushed back to her apartment. The noises continued that night, more frantic than ever. The next day, she decided to confront Mr. Foster, but he became defensive, warning her again to stay away from the room. Determined to understand, Rachel researched the building's history and discovered that several previous tenants had reported strange occurrences linked to the locked room. The mirror was said to have belonged to a woman who had gone mad, consumed by her own reflection. Feeling a responsibility to help, Rachel returned to the room with sage and candles, attempting to cleanse the space. As she lit the candles, the mirror's surface rippled, and she could see the woman's tormented face staring back at her. "Help me," the figure pleaded, her voice echoing in Rachel's mind. With tears in her eyes, Rachel promised to remember her, and as she spoke, the air in the room shifted. The next day, she found the locked room empty, no more sounds, no more whispers. The energy had changed, and Rachel felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had released the trapped spirit, finally giving her the peace she had long sought. 25. The shadows in the hallway. When Rachel moved into a historic apartment building, she was drawn in by its vintage charm and affordable rent. The landlord, Mr. Thompson, was a gregarious man who loved to share the building's history. He mentioned a series of odd occurrences, warning her that some residents claimed to see shadows moving in the hallways at night. "Just ignore them," he advised with a chuckle. "They won't hurt you." At first, Rachel thought it was all just old building quirks, but soon she began to notice strange things. Shadows flickered in her peripheral vision, darting away whenever she turned to look. At night, she heard soft whispers that seemed to echo down the hall, but when she ventured out to investigate, she found nothing. One evening, while trying to sleep, Rachel was jolted awake by the sound of children laughing in the hallway. Groggy and curious, she opened her door and stepped into the dark corridor. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence. As she walked down the hall, she noticed a shadow flitting past her, just out of sight. Feeling unnerved, Rachel decided to confront Mr. Thompson about the whispers and shadows. He grew serious, recounting the story of a group of children who had lived in the building decades ago. They had tragically drowned in a nearby river, and some residents believed their spirits lingered, playing in the hallways. Determined to help the lost souls find peace, Rachel decided to hold a small vigil. She set up candles and left toys in the hallway, hoping to honor their memory. That night, as she sat in silence, the atmosphere shifted. The shadows began to dance around her, flickering in and out of view. Suddenly, she heard the children's laughter again, but this time it felt joyful rather than haunting. The shadows seemed to swirl around her, and Rachel felt an overwhelming sense of warmth. She knew she had reached the spirits and helped them find a moment of happiness. From that day on, the strange occurrences lessened, and the building felt more peaceful. Rachel learned that sometimes a little compassion can go a long way in healing the past. 26. The rattling pipes. Mark was thrilled to rent a small studio in a century-old building. The landlord, Mrs. Stevens, was an eccentric woman who often warned tenants about the noisy pipes. "They can rattle and clank at night," she said, laughing. "Don't let them keep you awake." At first, Mark dismissed her warnings. But as soon as he settled in, he began to hear strange noises coming from the walls, pipes rattling, low groans, and whispers that echoed in the stillness. The sounds grew louder at night, often accompanied by a chilling draft that swept through the room. One particularly restless night, the noises intensified. Mark bolted upright in bed, his heart racing. He felt a presence in the room, as if someone or something was watching him. The rattling grew louder, vibrating through the walls, and he could almost make out a voice saying, "Help me." Unable to take it anymore, Mark confronted Mrs. Stevens the next day. She looked grave and told him about a previous tenant who had died in the apartment under mysterious circumstances. She was found by the pipes, Mrs. Stevens whispered. "They say her spirit is still trapped here." Determined to help, Mark decided to perform a cleansing ritual in his studio. He lit sage and spoke the tenant's name, acknowledging her presence. As he did, the rattling pipes began to calm, and a warm breeze enveloped him. From that night on, the atmosphere shifted. The noises faded, and the air felt lighter. Mark knew he had helped the spirit find peace, transforming his apartment into a sanctuary rather than a source of fear. 27. The stained glass. Nina was enchanted by a quaint apartment with beautiful stained glass windows. The landlord, Mr. Hargrove, warned her to be cautious about the windows. They have a way of showing things, he said cryptically. Sometimes they reveal more than they should. At first, Nina thought he was joking, but soon she noticed the windows seemed to change throughout the day. Shadows danced across the glass, casting eerie patterns in her living room. One afternoon, she swore she saw a figure standing outside, staring in at her. As night fell, Nina sat by the window, watching the colors shift. She felt drawn to the stained glass, and suddenly, a vision appeared. A woman in a flowing dress, crying for help. Startled, Nina blinked, and the figure vanished, leaving her shaken. Desperate for answers, Nina asked Mr. Hargrove about the history of the building. He revealed that the stained glass had once belonged to a wealthy family who had lost their daughter in a tragic accident. They say her spirit is trapped in the glass, he explained. She seeks to be remembered. Feeling a connection to the spirit, Nina decided to honor her memory. She placed flowers by the window and lit a candle, speaking the girl's name aloud. As she did, the colors of the stained glass began to shimmer and swirl, illuminating the room with a warm glow. That night, Nina felt a gentle presence beside her, as if the spirit was finally at peace. The stained glass no longer felt ominous. Instead, it became a beautiful reminder of a lost life, forever honored in her home. 28. The Mysterious Letter. After losing her job, Jenna moved into a cheap apartment with a long history. The landlord, Mr. Mitchell, was a reclusive man who rarely spoke about the building's past. One day, Jenna discovered an old letter tucked away in the back of a closet, addressed to a previous tenant. Curiosity piqued, she opened it and began reading. The letter spoke of strange occurrences in the apartment, disembodied voices, objects moving on their own, and a growing sense of dread. The final line sent chills down her spine. I fear something is watching me. I can no longer stay. Feeling unnerved, Jenna confronted Mr. Mitchell about the letter. He grew defensive, insisting that the building was perfectly fine. People just let their imaginations run wild, he muttered. But as she looked into his eyes, she sensed he was hiding something. That night, Jenna heard faint whispers in her apartment, echoing the words from the letter. Help us! Help us! Panic set in as she realized the previous tenant's fears were real. The voices seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, echoing through the dark. Determined to confront whatever was haunting her, Jenna held a small gathering with friends to cleanse the space. As they sat in a circle, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a sense of urgency. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through, and Jenna felt a presence in the room. We're trapped, a voice cried. Help us find peace. With tears in her eyes, Jenna spoke softly, acknowledging the spirit's plight and promising to remember them. From that night forward, the whispers lessened and the atmosphere shifted. Jenna found a sense of calm in her apartment, knowing she had helped the lost souls find a measure of peace. 29. The Ghostly Gardener. After moving into a charming little cottage, Emily was captivated by its overgrown garden. The landlord, Mrs. Harlow, had mentioned a gardener who had once tended to the flowers. He loved this place, she said wistfully, but he passed away years ago. As Emily settled in, she felt an odd attachment to the garden. Every morning, she would discover new blooms that hadn't been there the day before, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers. One afternoon, she was pruning the hedges when she felt a gentle touch on her shoulder. Startled, she turned but found no one there. That night, she had a vivid dream of the gardener, an older man with kind eyes, tending to the flowers. "Thank you for caring for my garden," he whispered, a warm smile on his face. When Emily woke, she felt a sense of purpose. She needed to honor his memory. Determined to continue his work, Emily began to restore the garden, planting new flowers and clearing away the weeds. As she worked, she felt a comforting presence beside her, guiding her hands. The garden flourished, blooming brighter than ever before. One evening, while watering the plants, she noticed the ghostly figure of the gardener standing in the moonlight, watching her with approval. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice like a gentle breeze. "You've brought life back to this place." From that day on, Emily felt a deep connection to the garden. It became her sanctuary, filled with vibrant colors and the spirit of the gardener who loved it so dearly. She learned that sometimes those who have passed on can find joy in the lives we lead and the memories we choose to honor. 30. The Creaking Floorboards. Jake was thrilled to find a cozy apartment in an old building, complete with hardwood floors and vintage charm. The landlord, Mr. Collins, seemed kind but warned him about the creaking floorboards. "They can be a bit loud at night," he said with a wink. "Just don't let them bother you." At first, Jake laughed it off, but as he settled in, he began to hear the creaks growing louder at night. They sounded like footsteps pacing back and forth in the living room. It was unsettling, but he brushed it off as typical old building noises. One night, while trying to sleep, the sounds became more pronounced. It felt as if someone was walking around in his apartment. Heart racing, Jake got up to investigate but found nothing amiss. The air felt heavy and the atmosphere shifted. Desperate for answers, he asked Mr. Collins about the history of the building. The landlord's demeanor changed, and he spoke in hushed tones about a tenant who had lived there decades ago, a reclusive woman who had vanished without a trace. "They say she roams the halls, looking for something she lost," he said, his eyes filled with concern. Determined to help, Jake decided to hold a small gathering with friends to acknowledge the spirit. As they sat together, sharing stories and laughter, the creaking noises began to fade. It was as if the spirit was drawn to their energy. That night, Jake dreamt of the woman, her face filled with sorrow. "I just want to be remembered," she whispered. When he awoke, he knew he had to honor her memory. He placed a small photograph of her on his mantle and lit a candle, inviting her spirit to rest. From that night on, the creaking floorboards softened and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Jake felt a sense of peace in his apartment, knowing he had helped the lost spirit find solace.